leaders who are attentive to their surroundings tend to see what's going on and are able to answer the first ethical question, what's going on.
Yeah, so if there's a core passion that I have in life around the topic of ethics, it's about all the people who had access to the information that somebody else was doing something wrong and they did nothing about it. And to be quite honest, I don't think we know that much about how to stop the next Bernie Madoff from doing something wrong, or some of our political leaders who have engaged in very bad behavior. I fully expect we will have others who will engage in very bad behavior in the future. But what I find striking is that in almost all of the newspaper stories of person acting with bad intent, there were hundreds of people who had access to the data and they did little about that. So one of the stories that I tell in my recent book, The Power of Noticing, has to do with a 2005 story where I was serving as an expert witness for the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice was suing essentially the entire tobacco industry. And after I had spent over 160 hours working on this case for the Department of Justice, I was sitting in a room in Washington, D.C. on April 30th, 2005, and I was there to prepare with the attorney who was in charge of my testimony to be on trial on Wednesday, May 4th. And I showed up, and the attorney I was working with was a fairly formal young man, brilliant young attorney, and I only met him about 7 weeks earlier, and I have this distinct memory of meeting him, and he referred to me as Professor Bazerman. I said I prefer Max, and he said I'll try Professor Bazerman, and it took about 2 weeks to get from Professor Bazerman to Max. Okay, but about 5 weeks before the episode that I'm going to describe, we had switched to Max. And he walks in that morning and he says, "Good morning, Professor Bazerman." And my ears perk up when I hear Professor Bazerman. Like, why is he calling me Professor Bazerman all of a sudden? And what follows is he says, the Department of Justice requests that you amend your testimony to note that it would not be relevant if any of the following 4 legal conditions existed. And then he read me a bunch of legalese that I didn't come close to understanding. And then he asked whether I so amended my testimony. And I said to him, "Now, you know I didn't understand what you just said. And if I did understand what you just said, I'd probably say no, so why would I potentially say yes?" And he said, "Because if you don't say yes, there's a good chance my superiors will remove you from the case before you testify on Wednesday." Now, I'm not a lawyer, and this sounded wrong, but I had never been busier in my life. I said no, so I didn't amend my testimony. And then what followed in the next couple of weeks was an intense level of activity, both on this court case, and then when the court case ended, I was behind on my commitments at my university. So I kind of moved on. So I said no to the request, but something very strange had happened. And then about 7 weeks go by. The case, in fact, ended. The judge had not yet decided on the case. And on June 17th, I woke up in London at 5 a.m., wide awake, and I opened up my computer, went to the New York Times webpage, and on the front page of the New York Times, on June 17th, 2005, there was a story about a guy named Matthew Myers, who I knew about. I didn't know him at the time. I do know him now. And he had also been an expert witness in the case. He was and is the president of Tobacco Free Kids, one of the leading anti-tobacco organizations in the world. And the story was about the fact that he had come forward with evidence that Robert McCullum, the number 2 official in the U.S. Department of Justice, had attempted to manipulate his testimony. And specifically, he was asked to amend it to note that it would not be relevant if any of the following 4 legal conditions existed. And it was like, one, it was like this deja vu experience, even though I was not Matthew Myers. And 2, I had this enormous sense that I goofed on April 30th because I didn't tell the press. I didn't find out what I should do. And people who want to defend me basically will say, but you said no, and you didn't know what to do, and you were busy. And I think that that's exactly the condition in which we see something bad happen, and we don't act on it. We don't act on it because we're busy. We know how to solve other problems. We don't know what to do in that particular situation. But I certainly remember this intense feeling, there's something wrong here. And I continue to be critical that was on a Saturday, April 30th. But May 2nd, I should have been calling friends in D.C. who could tell me, what was this all about? What should I be doing about it? And so I think of Matthew Myers as a hero for coming forward. I found myself in London when I now have this information, and it's 5 a.m., 12 o'clock in Boston and Washington, and I still don't know what I'm supposed to do about it. And so I called Marla, who I'm married to, woke her up, and I told her what I've just told you. And I said, I think I'm supposed to do something about this, but by the time you in Washington wake up in the morning, I'm going to be busy. I had a full day of commitments. And I said, so Marla, can you call your friends in Washington and figure out what I should do? I'll call you as soon as I get back to my hotel this evening. So 12 hours later at 5 p.m., I call Marla and I say, what's up? And Marla says, we don't have time to talk. You need to call Lewis Clark at the Government Accountability Project. They represent whistleblowers. He's your attorney. He's waiting for your call. As soon as you're done talking to him, there's a reporter at the Washington Post who's ready to cover your story. Now, what I find fascinating about Marla in this story is she only had 3 hours from 9 to 12 East Coast time to figure out what I should do. And she was able to put together a game plan. So any notion that I couldn't have acted on April 30th is simply wrong, because Marla found a strategy going forward.
And created conditions.
Absolutely. Exactly right. So, and for me, sort of I'm both embarrassed by the episode, but I also find it enormously helpful because it helps me empathize with other people's failures and to think about how do you develop a mentality that when you see something that looks wrong, you don't just drop it. I think most of us like to solve problems we know how to solve. And on April 30th, I sort of had a problem and I didn't know how to solve it, and I had a bunch of other problems that I knew more about how to solve, and I think my attention was diverted. So Bernie Madoff, the person who committed this enormous Ponzi scheme, and there were lots of feeder funds who invested their clients' money with Bernie Madoff, and a lot of people want to know, so did they not notice, or did they notice but not act?